Okay. Hello. This and that information, the autonomouscollective.net. 29 September, how time flies. And we're going back to, or we're continuing on with Saenz de Sicilia, book on subsumption, chapter 1 continued. I can't remember where I left off, so we're just going to start with Hegel. And also because I screwed up the last one anyway, so we'll start on page 38 of the text. Assuming we can find it. So by the end of the week, we should have finished chapter 2, perhaps. This just gives you a sense of where we're headed. The point of doing De Sicilia's book is because it has, I think, a useful approach to articulate, and yes, the word articulate actually kind of works here, is to articulate the difference or the evolution or the motion between Kant, Hegel, and Marx. It actually, and I'm proposing that subsumption is one way in which you can work through not only the issue of issues of subjectivity, but also issues of for example, somewhere, and I think it may be in the De Sicilia article, and that is to work through the issues of the labor theory of value. And I like his approach to doing this because it doesn't get into this sort of moment where it becomes mystical. Rather, it actually, you can see it as both an ontological and an epistemological move. That is, it is human behavior, and it does fit a kind of model both of humanity, as it were, or humanism, and models that are acceptable to social science. So I actually like the way this goes, or the way he's done it, in order to explain certain things that always appear as a kind of gap. I think you could see that in the Battistoni text. It's not a big gap; it's a little gap, but it's a gap nonetheless, and one that opens us up to some explanatory problems or interpretive problems. So anyway, without all that yammering, I will continue. Hegel's critique of subsumption. The significance of Kant's critique of theoretical reason for Hegelian philosophy lies not only in the former's quest to demonstrate which kind of judgments about objects are legitimate, that is, taken here to mean universally valid in the sense expounded above, but arises equally from its conclusion that these judgments have already taken place when we experience an object. Kant discovered the conceptual mediation in the form of judgments of subsumption under pure concepts, implicit in all apparently immediate knowledge. Now, this is, this moment where let me break here for a second and say, this is that kind of moment where you can critique issues, for example, of quote unquote design, and not simply design in the propaganda or commodity object sense, but a kind of underlying structural question. So I like this moment because it is a way in which you can link all the sort of social ontology and all that other jazz and kind of work through that to see the underlying structural questions. Back to the text, this transition from immediacy to its mediating condition is a movement derived from Kant's pre-critical logic, where discrete concepts were shown to be the product of subsumptive judgment acts, footnote 79. But whilst in formal logic, thought need only find agreement with itself in order to produce valid judgments in the sphere of experience dealt with in the first critique, that is, transcendental logic. Thought must find agreement with its other, that in the subject, which is not a determination of thought, that is sensible intuition in order for an object to be known. You see, this is that, the solipsism problem kind of, and is useful for us from a critical point of view. But anyway, that's another thing. Transcendental logic represents Kant's attempt to guarantee the correspondence of thought and object by enclosing them within a unifying law-bound structure of subjectivity. On this account, to know an object is to have specified subsumptively the consistency of its empirical content according to the basic categorical determinations of the understanding. It's all, this one sentence says, well, it says a lot. Let's put it that way. This is the epistemological context in which subsumption emerges in the critique of pure reason as a condition of possibility for the experience of object, which is equated with knowledge thereof. For Hegel, Kant was correct to argue that thought is always implicit in the constitution of objectivity, and this involvement is a process entirely immanent and internal to consciousness. Hegel recognized that in subsuming intuitions under concepts in this way, consciousness permeates them with itself, with its own unity and self-relation, sublating their particular immediacy into the universality and determinateness that for him, as for Kant, constitute objectivity. Quote, the comprehension of an object consists in nothing else than that the ego makes it its own, pervades it and brings it into its own form, that is, into the universality that is immediately a determinateness, or a determinateness that is immediately universality. As intuited, or even in ordinary conception, the object is still something external and alien. When it is comprehended, the being in and for itself, which it possesses in intuition and pictorial thought, is transformed into a positedness. The I, in thinking, it pervades it. Now, footnote 80, close quote. Now, let me break here for a second and say, this is an important moment. This idea is important in a variety of activities. In terms of my own stuff, it happens in the in discourse about objects, about, well, art objects, let's say that. But it doesn't have to be art object, it can be any object, and or political discourse. It is that kind of moment. It's like rhetorical projection, etc. So anyway, in accordance with critical philosophy's new understanding of the object as pre-constituted by the spontaneity of the I, Hegel holds that the determinations of the object emerge from the subjective process of this comprehension. Crucial to this conception is Kant's attempt in the transcendental deduction to reciprocally derive both the categories under which the manifold is subsumed from the unity of the I, and simultaneously the unity of the I from the act of thinking the object under these categories. I know that sounds like a, kind of a regress, but this works. It is the equation of conceptual universality with the unity of the pure I arising from the deduction that dissolves the opposition between truth and subjectivity and gives rise to a conception of the object as mediated. Now, this is the same mediation we've been discussing in other texts, and when Marx talks about it, this is the same thing. This forms the general structure of transcendental logic with which Hegel's philosophy engages, but despite his affinities with it, Hegel took issue with Kant's model of subsumptive cognition in three primary respects. Number one, the modeling of the apperceptive I, and therefore the transcendental subject, on the empirical psychological individual. Number two, the uncritical appropriation of the categories of the understanding from Aristotelian logic. And number three, the limitation of truth to objects of experience alone, which left critical philosophy still mired in the sphere of empirical appearance. So this is where Hegel takes, has issues and helps to return it to where Marx goes, right? Metacritically outlining these limits to Kant's model of cognition allowed Hegel to incorporate the basic movement of transcendental critique from conditioned to condition within a reconstructed outline of both the elements and the total structure of unity of Kantian thought. Remember how, Kantian thought looks like this huge, diagram. Anyway, neither of these two aspects, Hegel contested, was the product of a fully immanent philosophical derivation, and much extraneous and unjustified content had been smuggled into Kant's philosophy. But Hegel did not reject the basic structure of opposition between the unity and the determinateness of self-consciousness. Instead, Hegel subjected them to the dialectical critique that would produce, number one, a phenomenology of spirit in reference to transcendental subjectivity. Number two, a speculative logic in reference to the categories. Number three, a new conception of truth as speculative totality. Now, these transformations bear on the status of subsumption within Hegel's system, insofar as both the structured context of this subsumptive act and the specific determinations executed by it, by the subsumptive act, are subject to a new derivation that fundamentally alters their nature. This is the whole point of, kind of moving the motion thing, right? Hegel's modification of the concept of subsumption begins first and foremost with his critique of the constitutive divisions of transcendental logic, specifically those which precipitate the emergence of subsumption in the critique of pure reason. That is, the basic opposition of concepts of the understanding and the manifold of intuition carried over from Kant's distinction between the empty form of thought given in general logic and the content to which it is applied. So you can see this, theory practice thing, that why that's still important and why Hegel needs to comment on it. The crucial consequence of this division is that Kantian philosophy takes the subsumed to be entirely unhomogeneous to that which subsumes it, such that for Hegel, the subsumption amounts to an external imposition on the matter given in intuition. That is, the empirical material, the manifold of intuition and representation, first exists on its own account, and then the understanding approaches it, brings unity into it, and by abstraction, raises it to the form of universality. Footnote 81. Thought thus pervades intuition to know it as its own, but does so coercively, imposing its own relations and mediation upon it, rather than drawing out the truth of those that are already present within it. The manifold neither has nor develops an inner concrete universality, and only obtains universality when the functions of unity given by the understanding have been determined in it subsumptively. So, this is putting a little more, putting veins into the body, whatever. For Hegel, this model is consonant with the worldview of Newtonian science, for which the universal, that is the genus, etc., contained in the particular, is not determined on its own account, nor is it intrinsically connected with what is particular. But universal, remember, we've talked about this right before, right? Universal, particular, and singularity, right? But universal and particular are mutually external and contingent, just as much as the particularities that are combined are on their own account external to each other and contingent. Footnote 82. Now, on the basis of this standpoint, it appears that I possess concepts and the capital C concept, just as I also possess a coat, complexion, and other external properties. Footnote 83. Now, despite their a priori interconnection, concepts and intuitions remain utterly distinct and implicitly self-sufficient sources of cognition within the Kantian system. Indeed, it is precisely this difference that Kant necessitates their mediation in a third thing, the transcendental schema. Hegel opposed this fixed externality of faculties, arguing that the difference between sensible intuition, and concepts is one only of the forms of a content that remains one and the same. Footnote 84. In Faith and Knowledge, Hegel's early review of the reflective philosophies of his time, the primary distinction between intuitive and conceptual syntheses appears simply in that the concept grasps the positedness of determinations in distinction from its own self. Quote, synthetic unity is only concept because it binds the difference in such a way that it also steps outside of it and faces it in relative antithesis. This is a good way to talk about thesis antithesis. Footnote 85. Whilst the centrality of synthetic unity would be reduced in Hegel's later works, the emphasis on a, quote, truly necessary, absolute, original identity of opposites, unquote, would be retained in opposition to the Kantian idea of an original division of the faculties that constitute only an aggregate and not a system. See, there's a difference between, some of its part and the whole, right? Footnote 86. Hegel thus disparages the weakness of the subsumptive-synthetic relation between concepts and intuitions that is supposed to ground the truth of experience for Kant, describing it as a relation that unites the two elements of cognition in an external, superficial way, just as a piece of wood and a leg might be bound together by a cord. Which raises a whole bunch of other interesting things. Footnote 87. Such unity is not, for Hegel, a properly philosophical unity in which relations between elements and higher determinations are developed immanently out of those elements as their implicit conditions. Quote, the very expression synthesis easily recalls the conception of an external unity and a mere combination of entities that are intrinsically separate. This is that aggregation thing I just talked about. Footnote 88. Kantianism, by asserting a model of mechanical connections between independent elements, gives the opposition of thought, an external reality held by normal consciousness, a philosophical articulation. Remember, I'm talking about philosophical articulation, reproducing it in the transcendental distinction between the object as it is for us and as it is in itself. Because our sensible mode of intuiting the external object is deficient, lacks conceptual coherence and unity, it must be subsumed under an alien schema of universality, and this subsumption under the species alters what is immediate. Footnote 89. Let me go back and look at footnote 86. Insofar as Kant indicates the philosophical imperative is to construct knowledge as a scientific system, it is still only on the basis of turning this aggregate into an architectonic whose unity does not shape, but is built upon its contents. So this idea of the architectonic, I think, is, and you can see how this comes out in critical language on questions of the difference between these things, and that the architectonic actually has a lot of implications even in other areas. Okay, back to the text. Only the object for us, that which results from subsumptive judgment, is true for Kant. And yet this truth is paradoxically qualified as having no bearing on the thing that it might actually be, lost as it is in the process of its comprehension. For Hegel, this expulsion of the in itself from the realm of knowledge leads Kantianism to yield only a truth of the false. Quote, it seems absurd if what we want is knowledge of external objects to alter these external objects by our very abstractive activity upon them. Think of paintings. Quite absurd to want to come back to know things as they are in themselves and yet alter them. Thus, receiving things into our knowledge only is altered. The alteration consists in the fact that we separate off what is singular or external and hold the truth of the thing to lie in what is universal rather than in what is singular or external. quite oddly, for Kant, it is by altering things that we are persuaded that we secure their inner truth. Footnote 90, unquote. The one-sidedness of this structure of determination is, on Hegel's account, exactly what undermines the Kantian conception of truth, reducing it to a tautological affirmation of subjectivity that assimilates consciousness as other, the in itself, to itself, whilst simultaneously reducing itself, qua I, to the empirical. And you can see this is, well, anyway, it thereby fails to recognize in anything other than a nominal sense that expounded in Kant's refutation of idealism, the subject's own mediation in and through this other with the process of subsumption effected unilaterally and mechanically, even by Kant's own admission upon the sensibly given material. Footnote 91. The understanding is in this way an intrinsically empty form, which, on the one hand, obtains a reality through the said given content, and on the other hand, abstracts from that content, that is to say, lets it drop as something useless. Footnote 92. And yet, in spite of this, transcendental subjectivity cannot entirely dispose of the in itself that stands beyond it. It remains beholden to precisely that which it repudiates. So this is this, without going to Freud or anything, you could see where this could go, right? The conceptual identity produced by the understanding finds itself immediately confronted by or next to an infinite non-identity with which it must coalesce in some incomprehensible way. Footnote 93. Let's just break for a moment and look at footnote 91. Subsumption is mechanical for Kant, insofar as determinative judgments of objects are concerned. See the opposition of mechanical and artful subsumption in Kant. So there's something there, right? Something for critical apparatus. The epistemological horizon of Kantian philosophy, the limit of comprehension implied by it, therefore, remains entirely within the antithesis between nature and reason. Nature and reason. Subject and object, thought and being, willing and acting, finite and infinite, etc., precisely because of its original incapacity to know the object as it really is. Footnote 94. A formal, quote, a formal idealism which in this way sets an absolute ego point and its intellect on one side and an absolute manifold or sensation on the other side is a dualism. Footnote 95. We're page 43. Kant does, of course, recognize the higher unity that would resolve these oppositions in the form of reason's orientation towards the unconditioned. However, this orientation, far from genuinely grounding the unifying movement of thought, has, in contrast to the objective universality of the understanding's fixed determinations, only the inferior status of being responsible for, at best, the production of regulative principles, and at worst, transcendental illusions. So let me break here for a second. The difference between the production of regulative principles and transcendental illusions, you can sort of see at work in, contemporary ideology. But anyway, back to the text. The constitutive oppositions of Kantianism are therefore superseded only subjectively in the ideas, which have no objective, that is, real truth content. Again, Hegel criticized the division separating the discrete concepts of the understanding and the unifying tendency of reason, what Hegel just simply calls the concept, big C, right, as a characteristic limit of the, quote, reflective philosophy of subjectivity. They're heading in the same direction, right? Quote, Kantian philosophy declares finite cognition to be all that is possible. It falls back into absolute finitude and subjectivity, and the whole task and content of this philosophy is not the cognition of the absolute, but the cognition of this subjectivity. You see, there's misdirection going on, or at least that Hegel perceives within the context of Kant. Because Kant aims at a critique of the finite intellect rather than knowledge of the absolute. You can see, Hegel's moving somewhere else, right? His philosophy is resigned to a progression in finite determinations, accepting that an endless aiming at the concrete is required for thought, a filling up in accordance with the rule which completion prescribes, albeit a completion never to be realized, only striven towards in the mode stipulated by its abstract universality. Footnote 97. Quote, Kantian philosophy leads knowledge into consciousness and self-consciousness, but from this standpoint maintains it to be a subjective and finite knowledge. Thus, although it deals with the infinite idea, expressing its formal categories and arriving at its concrete claims, it yet again denies all this to be the truth, making it a simple subjective because it has at once for all accepted finite knowledge as the fixed and ultimate standpoint. Footnote 98. It is precisely in the rejection of this finitude that Kant's critical differentiation between the truth of legitimate and illegitimate judgments of subsumption is called into question by Hegel. What we must ask them is how the character and effects of subsumptive judgment are altered by Hegel's refutation of the static division between the aesthetic, analytic, and dialectic moments of transcendental subjectivity, and what role subsumption plays in Hegel's reconfigured concept of the subject as process. Now, with all due respect, and I don't know the literature that well, and I've been trying to track down this article that describes it better. For example, Angela Davis's dissertation in looking at Kantian perceptions or Kant's perception of the French Revolution kind of points in that direction relative to, probably Marcuse's advice, but it's I think, worth considering. Anyway, new section 2.1, a new derivation, overcoming the empirical epistemological boundary of Kant's philosophical claims, specifically the adherence to a structurally constitutive distinction of subject and object, is the task Hegel set out to achieve through his dialectical treatment of consciousness and the phenomenology of spirit. The phenomenology text deals with the development of the relation between consciousness and its object, progressing through the series of forms or shapes of experience, each of which specifies a different relationship of knowledge to its object. This developmental process passes from the immediacy of sense certainty through the emergence of self-consciousness from relations of recognition between individuals to the social forms of spirit, arriving ultimately at the standpoint of absolute knowing from which the opposition between subject and object, that is, subject and object as substance, is sublated into the unity of spirit with itself, and the knowledge of experience is resolved into a pure ontology in the logic, i.e., not simply the determinations of the object as it appears to consciousness, but the pure determinations of the object as it, quote unquote, actually is. A lot going on there. Hegel's initial rupture with Kant consists in the fact that rather than attempting to ascertain the necessary content and structure of experience in order to then critically determine what counts as knowledge, for Hegel, the process of reflecting on knowledge cannot be divorced from knowledge itself, as illustrated by his well-known metaphor, which likens Kant's critical method to the desire to learn how to swim before getting in the water. You can see where that can go, right? That's footnote 99. With this process, philosophy has already begun. It's not simply the final stage of consciousness taken in isolation that can be thought of as the true standpoint of knowledge, but rather all the stages in the totality of their development that constitute the truth of knowledge as a process. Quote, in this movement, the passive subject itself perishes. It enters into the differences and the content and constitutes, because it does that, determinateness, the differentiated content and its movement, instead of remaining inertly over against it. Footnote 100. Subjectivity cannot thus be reduced to a static aggregation of principles and powers, but is instead grasped as the dynamic movement of the whole in its dialectical self-development. This informs the status of subsumption in Hegel, insofar as the Kantian I is premised on precisely the fixed division of faculties that Hegel rejects, specifically the dualism of sensibility and intellect, whose heterogeneous contents have to be brought systematically into relation. The overcoming of precisely this division by virtue of subsumption under concepts forms the basis for the reciprocal establishment of the unity of consciousness and the consistency of experience in Kant's first critique. Hegel's dialectical critique of consciousness in the Phenomenology, however, transforms this oppositional structure into, yes, a processual, that is, a process-oriented or engaged concept of subject as the organic self-development of an, in the last instance, objective process. The unity of consciousness is thus no longer a static structure of self-relation, self-relation, but the dynamic unfolding of knowing through its various shapes or movements. Integral to this movement is the supersession of the finite standpoint of individual consciousness and the development of the social concept of subjectivity, emerging in the transition from subject-object relations to subject-subject relations, and then subject-substance relations in the various forms of ethical life. Hegel's exposition attempts to demonstrate, in the first place, that interpersonal relations are an implicit condition for the existence of individual self-consciousness. This is important for a variety of other reasons. That is, in the first place, that interpersonal relations are an implicit condition for the existence of individual self-consciousness. We know ourselves by our others, right? At this stage, the problem ceases to have a solely epistemological significance, i.e., of the correspondence between thought and object, and instead becomes a problem of social recognition, because the object that appears to consciousness is revealed to itself to be another free self-consciousness, i.e., a subject. Now, what is at stake here is the way in which objective structures of recognition produce contradictory relations of misrecognition between individual self-consciousnesses. Not only is the you can see where Freud could go from that. Anyway, not only is the subsumption of intuitions under concepts that is so fundamental for Kant, thereby demoted to a partial and limited stage in this conceptual development, but the very constitutive limit of knowledge set out by Kant, that is, individual empirical experience, is superseded as consciousness, quote, leaves behind it the colorful show of the sensuous here and now. Footnote 101. Subsequently, at the point in Hegel's exposition where social relations emerge as objective structures rather than contingent relations between isolated individuals, that's where methodological individual, that's the critique of methodological individualism. That is, with the emergence of spirit, you see, that not necessarily is the critique of, methodological individualism. That is, with the emergence of spirit, contradiction arises primarily at the level of the relation between individual self-consciousnesses, the I, which is subject, and the forms of social relations or of ethical life that unite them, the we that is substance. Although Hegel does not explicitly discuss these contradictions in terms of subsumption, their conceptual structure is homologous with what he identified as two defining features of Kantian subsumption. That is, number one, the weak synthetic unity of heterogeneous elements, and the coercive determination of individual elements under an abstract universality. Number two, insofar as subsumptive relations thus obtain at the levels of structures of spirit, they are relations between individuals, and the universality of the social form they exist within, and are constituted by, in contrast to the simple case of domination of one's self-consciousness by another, described in the section on lordship and bondage. You can see, it has, it's not simply, isolated. It has, implications about production. This can occur in terms of the dominant universality of the social substance, which subsumes individuals with antithetical desires, as in the case of ethical life, or of the alienated abstract universality of individual personhood under which the community proper is subsumed, as, for example, with private property in ancient Rome. Now, you can see this can go in other, let me break here for a second. This can go in other directions, gender divisions of labor. To some people, spouses are property, and you can see where that can go, right? Here, we find that the same structure of double determination that was operative in Kant's theory of subsumption, and which distinguished between, number one, the individual representations that are bound together by concepts, and number two, the relation of these unified representations to the compositional totality in which they are unified, is reproduced at the level of, number one, relations of recognition between individuals, and number two, relations of recognition between individuals and the community. Andrew Chitty, Chitty, draws attention to this in the following claim, quote, fully realized or absolute spirit is constituted only when this mutual recognition between individuals that brings into existence a universal self is supplemented by a second mutual recognition between this universal self and the individuals that compose it, or between individuals acting as members of this universal self and the same individuals acting as particular individuals. Footnote 102. It's not necessary to give an in-depth analysis of all subsumptive relations and their sublation in the phenomenology. What is pertinent to the problematic as a whole is the fundamental transformation of the concept of the subject that Hegel carries out. With Kant, the fixed transcendental structure of subjectivity provides both the content and resources that give rise to subsumptive judgment acts. Hegel lauds the Critique of Pure Reason because in it, the unity which constitutes the nature of the concept, big C concept, is recognized as the original synthetic unity of apperception, as unity of the I think, or of self-consciousness. But if this conception of the I is expanded, as it is in the phenomenology, then the context and resources for subsumption are thereby also altered. Footnote 103. Most important for the present inquiry is the aforementioned transition that occurs in the course of the process of the subjective development of spirit and leads to the exposition of properly social, as opposed to merely interpersonal forms of self-consciousness. This transition from self-consciousness to spirit lays the foundation for the analysis of a concept of subsumption that pertains to individuals subsumed under objectively universal structures of sociality, which constitute their collective and individual identities and practices. So this is a move not to some epiphenomenal spirit, but rather to a social spirit. Back to the text. We are no longer dealing with synthetic judgment acts internal to an individual consciousness, but with the development of relational social forms that determine individual identities and collective practices in terms of both their subjective and objective implications as developed in the phenomenology and, yes, the reason why we read philosophy of right. This is the first essential modification to the problem of subsumption that we can find in Hegel. It's why, this is why philosophy of right tends to be a threshold text. There is a second related aspect of Hegel's critique of subsumption in Kant that follows directly from this new concept of the subject as process. The issue of the content of that process, i.e., its determinate stages or shapes, and their objective status once the phenomenological derivation of ontology as logic has been achieved. This consists, first and foremost, in a critique of the specific forms of conceptual universality under which subsumption can occur, as well as to their status as actual abstractions rather than determinations of the object whose validity is limited to its appearance for us. See, this is that question of the moment of, describing the moment of abstraction, the actual abstraction. Back to the text. The exposition given by Hegel in the science of logic seeks to submit the categories of thought to a rigorous inquiry that does not depend on their belonging to an empirical consciousness. Hegel believed that he had already achieved the imminent development of self-conscious spirit into logic with the phenomenology, but attempts to dialectically develop the determinations of thought out of their own immanent content and contradictions. Footnote 104. Hegel, therefore, introduces not only a new conception of subjectivity, but also of logic. And that's the key point, in the course of which the conceptual form of subsumption would be posited with a quote-unquote higher determinacy. Let me break here for a second and, speculate, higher determinacy. What does that mean, And we'll get to that in the next section. 2.2, section 2.2, from pure concepts to dialectical categories. Page 48, we're in chapter 1. As we've seen, Kant believed formal logic to be devoid of specific content, merely describing the empty functions of thought as such. Yet, when transcendentally adapted to the form of intuition as quote-unquote pure concepts of the understanding, such functions came to constitute the a priori structure of all objective experience. In this adapted form, the concepts enumerated traditional metaphysical categories such as quality, quantity, relation, etc. Transcendental logic was the product of this logicization of metaphysical concepts, which displace these determinations of the object to the subject structure itself, and then reintroduce them into the cognized object via the subsumptive operation. So let me break here for a second and there are layers or sedimentations, if you want to use another kind of philosophy. Anyway, Hegel was broadly in accord with the necessity of such internalization and the explication of a subjectively mediated structure of objectivity. Concerning Kant's transcendental deduction of the subject structure of consciousness, however, Hegel claimed that the specific thought determinations, the categories of the understanding which specified the modes of organizing and relating the determinations of the object to the unity of the I, were, firstly, not the product of an immanent derivation. He accused Kant of having naively appropriated the formal logic on which they were based from ordinary logic, a largely unmodified Aristotelian theory of judgment. And secondly, attenuated by their epistemologically restricted validity. Footnote 105, quote, first of all, the critical philosophy subjects to investigation the validity of the concepts of the understanding that are used in metaphysics, but also in the other sciences and in ordinary representation. This critique does not involve itself with the content, however, or with the determining mutual relationships of these thought determinations to each other. Instead, it considers them according to the antithesis of subjectivity and objectivity in general. The more detailed forms of the a priori, i.e., of thinking, which in spite of its objectivity is interpreted as a merely subjective activity, are presented in a systematic order, which, it may be remarked, rests only upon psychological historical foundations. This is where it begins to move, right? Footnote 106. Now, because the interest of the Kantian philosophy was directed to the so-called transcendental aspect of the categories, it treated them in such a way as to reveal nothing about what they are in themselves, what categories are, without the abstract relation to the ego common to all, and wherein their specific nature relatively to each other and their relationship to each other. Such questions were not an object of consideration, footnote 107. Now, continuing the efforts of his Jena system, note I wouldn't call it the Jena system. Hegel proposes in the Science of Logic to undertake a complete reconstruction of the categories of pure thought. One of the central premises of this project is the rejection of Kant's initially logical distinction between the form of thinking and content of thinking, an assumption that is problematically reproduced at the level of the relations of concepts and intuition, giving rise to the need for transcendental subsumption in order to establish this correspondence. Instead, Hegel proposes to take the categories of thought as simultaneously providing the content and form of a scientific inquiry into thinking. Quote, it's quite inept to say that logic abstracts from all content, that it teaches only the rules of thinking without any reference to what is thought, or without being able to consider its nature. Whereas thinking and the rules of thinking are supposed to be the subject matter of logic, these directly constitute its peculiar content. Far from objective thinking being formal, far from it standing in need of a matter to constitute an actual and true cognition, it is its content alone which has absolute truth. Or, if one still wanted to employ the word matter, it is the veritable matter, but a matter which is not external to the form, since this matter is rather pure thought and hence the absolute form itself. Footnote 108. Now, by asserting the identity of the form of thought and the content of thought within a single self-developing process whose method is also not to be distinguished, indistinguishable from its matter, Hegel was able to claim that his exposition constituted a systematic derivation, i.e., one in which each determination emerges imminently from the dialectical critique and determinate negation of the previous, something Kant never achieved, instead articulating his categories in parallel to each other. That's why the charts look weird. Furthermore, Hegel would claim that the results of this process, rather than being mere subjective forms of thought pertaining to individual consciousness in its opposition to the object, have objective validity, insofar as the determinations of logic are actual moments of a reality far more concrete than the sensory show of empirical experience. You could argue that that's the difference between 2.5D and 3D, but anyway. Thus, the science of logic in dealing with the thought determinations, which in general run through our mind instinctively and unconsciously, it will also be a reconstruction of those which are singled out by reflection and are fixed by it as subjective forms external to the matter and import of the determinations of thought, footnote 109. Such lifeless determinations of the understanding, which had been reduced by the logic of time to analytical, mechanical, that is, concept-less, begriffless, irrational procedures, are in Hegel's logic enfolded within the systematic sequence of logical form in their imminent development. are in Hegel's logic enfolded within the systematic sequence of logical forms in their imminent development. It is by virtue of the speculative identity of concepts and the concept, big C concept, and the concept, that critical velocity's antithesis between the limited abstract universality of the conceptual content of thought and the distributed universality of its external ground in individual consciousness is dissolved. It's a lot there, yes. Quote, the antithesis between form and content, which is given special validity when the concept, big C concept, is supposed to be what is only formal, now lies behind us, together with all the other antitheses that reflection keeps fixed. They have been overcome dialectically. See, this is that move to synthesis, i.e. through themselves, and it is precisely the big C concept that contains all the earlier determinations of thinking sublated within itself. Certainly, the concept, big C, must be considered as a form, but it is a form that is infinite and creative, one that both encloses the plenitude of all content within itself and at the same time releases it from itself. Footnote 110. Now, the second essential modification of subsumption that we find in Hegel's philosophy is therefore the idea that those determinations of the object through which subsumption might occur can only be understood in the fullness of their truth by grasping their place and actuality within the systematic totality of determinations in which externality and synthesis are sublated in the course of the organic development of mediating conditions. Now, these two aspects of Hegel's critique of Kant, therefore, articulate the unity of the processual, processual subjective totality, and with it, the function and implications of subsumption on an entirely new conceptual plane. Remember when I talk about layers. On one hand, it is the development of the process as a whole that gives unity and meaning to the various moments of its existence. On the other hand, the categories themselves, in their dialectical interrelation and development out of one another, are precisely what constitutes the determinate moments of the process. In this way, the basic Kantian structure of apperception has been retained, but the scope of the I and its moments have been both expanded and given a higher degree of conceptual coherence. Let me break here for a second and note that, maybe that's a dimensionality constraint. But anyway, back to the text. An important question arises at this point, namely how subsumption fits within the general movement of the big C concept as both a constitutive feature of the movement as such, and simultaneously as a part of one of its determinate stages or moments, which as a partial and thus inadequate moment will be abolished in the course of its development. Is this a repeat of the tension between synthesis and subsumption we found in Kant, i.e. of that between process and act? And is this tension resolved in Hegel's speculative repositioning of subsumption at a specific moment in the exposition of the concept as whole? All right, I'm going to stop there because, as I said, I think this allows us to see where there's on the one hand a kind of Kantian structure, but in Hegel's remarks on it, he begins to see, well, it's fine and dandy to have all these, structures, but how is it that they move? What kind of way in which we can talk about, the differences, with all due respect, between Kant's logic and Hegel's logic. So that's kind of where I want to leave us off. Let me say that we'll come back to section 2.3 tomorrow. And, you don't have to have everything read in place, but I think if you start getting into it, and if you have just a modicum of sort of sense of, well, what is Kant trying to do? And then what is Hegel trying to do? And why is Hegel commenting on Kant, which is the more important element for our little, process here. And you can see how it applies to other things. And aside from my little annotative comments, parenthetical comments, there's a lot there. It affects a variety of different types of aspects of activity or research or thought, and those are all still useful. They're still useful, particularly last week when we were talking about methodological individualism at all. We didn't get to the sort of punchline of that, and I will try and dig that up. Because it's still important to talk about, because certain other parties are still trying to dig up analytic Marxism, and maybe perhaps are not doing the best treatment of it. So anyway, there's that. So we're going to go back